It started with a pause, not the kind of pause you make when you're just thinking, but the kind where your eyes narrow, your mind starts putting pieces together, and you can feel the weight of the question forming. Joe Rogan leaned back in his chair, mid-conversation with his guest. The topic had somehow shifted to world religions, their histories, their reach, and then he just asked it plain and raw, but if Islam spread so far, how wasn't it all through war? It was a question that carried layers. On the surface, it sounded like simple curiosity. But underneath, it was the echo of a story so many of us have been told since we were kids. History books, pop culture, political rhetoric, all painting this picture of Islam sweeping across continents at the tip of a sword. The room fell silent for a beat, and in that silence you could almost hear the millions of people who have asked the exact same thing. The narrator's voice cuts in. It's true, Islam spread faster than almost any religion in human history, from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of Spain, from the bustling markets of West Africa to the far islands of Southeast Asia. And yes, wars did happen, as they have in the history of every civilization. But what if I told you that's not the whole story? What if I told you there's a side to this history that almost never makes it into the classroom? A side where soldiers aren't the main characters. Merchants are. Where conquests are not the climax, conversations are, and where faith didn't move forward by force, it moved forward by something far quieter and far more powerful. Back in the studio, Joe tilted his head as if waiting for the guest to challenge him to confirm the stereotype, to say yes, it was all battles and empire. But instead, the answer began with a shake of the head. No, the guest said softly, almost smiling, it wasn't like that. Joe raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? And that's when the story began to shift. Imagine the Arabian Peninsula wasn't the global powerhouse we picture when we think of later empires. It was a patchwork of tribes, caravans, and trade routes, connecting empires like Byzantium and Persia. Mecca, the birthplace of Islam, wasn't a military capital. It was a trading hub. The Kaaba was already a place where people from all over the region would gather, not for war, but for commerce, for pilgrimage, for treaties. When Prophet Muhammad began to teach Islam, the message wasn't wrapped in political conquest. It was wrapped in moral transformation, in truthfulness, justice, mercy. His early followers were merchants, craftsmen, shepherds, ordinary people, people whose lives began to reflect a standard of honesty and compassion so striking that others noticed. Joe leaned forward. So you're saying people just converted, without anyone making them? The guest nodded. Exactly. They saw something in the character of Muslims that they wanted for themselves, and when they asked, they were told about Islam. The narrator explains, from the very start, the Quran made something clear. There is no compulsion in religion. No one could be forced to believe. Faith was a choice, not a chain. That principle didn't just sit in scripture, it lived in the way Muslims conducted themselves. This is where the history gets fascinating. While some expansions of Muslim-ruled territories came through battles, and that is undeniable, vast regions that embraced Islam never saw a Muslim army at all. Think about Indonesia. Today, it's the largest Muslim-majority country in the world, yet not a single war was fought there to bring Islam. Instead, it arrived through traders from Arabia and India, who sailed into its ports carrying spices and their Joe frowned slightly, as if replaying history documentaries in his head. Wait, so like, these guys just showed up, did business, and people became Muslim? The guest chuckled. Yes, because these traders didn't cheat in their weights. They kept their promises. They spoke respectfully. They didn't lie, even when lying could have made them richer, and that stood out. It wasn't normal in many markets at the time. The narrator's voice deepens. In West Africa, Islam spread along the great trade routes of the Sahara. It came in the saddlebags of merchants and in the quiet dignity of scholars. It didn't come with chains. It came with ink, parchment, and ideas. Cities like Timbuktu became centers of learning, where the Quran was studied alongside mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The more Joe heard, the more he realized something. The spread of Islam wasn't just a story about where armies marched, it was about where hearts opened. It was about the moments in marketplaces, in homes, on long journeys, where one person's example of kindness, patience, and integrity was enough to spark a lifelong change in another. Man, Joe finally said, shaking his head, that's completely different from what I thought. The guest smiled. That's because the other version, the one about only swords and force, is simple. It's easy to package, but history, real history, is rarely that simple. The truth is far more human, and that's where the hook of this conversation took hold. Because here's the thing, when you remove the idea of forced conversion from the story of Islam's spread, something remarkable emerges. You begin to see a civilization driven not just by military power but by moral power, by the belief that truth, if lived sincerely, will draw people in without the need for coercion. The narrator pauses, letting the weight of that sink in. Joe's question, the one that seemed so casual at first, had opened the door to one of the most misunderstood truths in world history. And as the conversation continued, that door was about to swing open even wider, because the real story of Islam's growth isn't one of domination over bodies, it's one of attraction to values, and that changes everything. The conversation had just begun to warm up. Joe sat there, arms folded, still chewing on the idea that the spread of Islam wasn't simply a march of armies. But his curiosity wasn't satisfied yet. Okay, but then why do most of us, think of it that way? It was a fair question, because for many people in the West, the version of Islamic history they've been told is a story that begins and ends with the sword. From school textbooks to Hollywood epics, from passing comments in news cycles to casual dinner table conversations, the image is always the same. A map of the ancient world, and then a wave of color spreading across it, always paired with the idea of conquest. The narrator steps in. The misconception has roots, deep and tangled. Some of them grow from real historical battles, events like the early conflicts between Muslim and Byzantine forces, or the Umayyad expansions into North Africa and Spain. These events are undeniable, but they've often been presented as the reason for Islam's growth, not just a part of the complex picture. Joe frowned, nodding slowly. So basically the fighting part is all people hear about. Exactly. And here's why. The drama of war is easy to remember. It's visual, it's cinematic, it's simple. Peaceful trade routes, merchants keeping promises. That doesn't make the same kind of scene in a 2-minute TV segment. And so, over centuries, the human tendency to simplify turned a rich and layered history into a single storyline, one of force. The guest leaned in. And then over time, that storyline got reinforced by those who wanted Islam to be seen that way. Joe raised an eyebrow. You mean for political reasons? Absolutely, the guest replied. During the Crusades, for example, European chroniclers painted Islam as this violent, alien force that had swept in and crushed everything in its path. It made it easier to rally armies, easier to justify war. Later, during the colonial era, the same narrative was used to show Muslims as inherently aggressive, needing to be civilized or controlled. The narrator explains, it's not that wars didn't happen, they did, but the leap from Muslim armies fought to Islam's spread only through force is a leap that ignores centuries of evidence to the contrary, and once that leap was repeated enough times, it stuck. Joe shifted in his chair, tapping the table lightly. That's wild, man. I mean, if you grow up with that version, you don't even question it, it just feels obvious. And that's the dangerous thing about misconceptions. They don't need to be reinforced daily. Once they're planted, they live in the background of our thinking. They shape our assumptions without us even noticing. The guest continued, what most people don't realize is that some of the most Muslim-majority countries today were never even part of a Muslim empire during their conversion. Take Malaysia and Indonesia. Islam arrived there centuries before any Muslim ruler ever did, purely through trade, marriage and community interaction. The narrator's tone softens, but the misconception has another cost. It doesn't just distort history, it distorts human connection. When you believe a faith spread purely through violence, it's hard to see it as something people would willingly embrace. You stop asking why it appealed to so many, you stop looking for the values that might have drawn people in, and in doing so, you miss the heart of the story entirely. Joe leaned forward, elbows on the table. So the way I've been picturing it is like watching the wrong half of a movie. You get all the action scenes, but none of the character development. The guest smiled. Exactly. You know the ending but not the journey. The narrator paused. And here's the thing. History's journey is always more complicated than the slogans we inherit. For Islam, that journey includes poets and scholars, sailors and traders, farmers and craftsmen. It includes thousands of moments where one person's honesty at a market stall changed the path of another's life forever. But those moments are quiet. They're not written in the bold ink of battle map. They're the fine print in the story, and unless you lean in to read it, you'll miss it entirely. Joe sat back again, his eyes narrowing. So if the real story is so different, Why aren't we hearing it more often? The guest let the question hang for a moment before answering. Because changing a narrative takes time, and because sometimes, the truth is less convenient than the myth. But once you hear it, once you see the evidence, you can't unsee it. The narrator steps in once more, voice measured, and that's where the conversation turns. Because once you strip away the misconceptions, the question isn't how did Islam conquer, it's what made Islam so appealing, what made it worth adopting for people who had the freedom to choose. That's where we're going next. And it's here in the quiet truth that the most surprising part of this history begins to unfold. Joe's voice had that mix of disbelief and curiosity you hear when someone's worldview is shifting in real time. Wait, so you're telling me it was ideas, not armies? The guest smiled. Exactly. The real engine behind Islam's spread wasn't the sword, it was the way Muslims lived, their honesty, their compassion, the way they treated others, even strangers, even people who didn't share their faith. The narrator's tone takes over, steady and calm. To understand this, you have to picture the world of the 7th to 15th centuries, not as static maps in history books, but as living, breathing networks of people. Great trade routes stretched across deserts and seas, caravans moved through the Arabian Peninsula, linking Africa, Asia and Europe. Ports bustled with merchants from India, China, the Middle East. In those days, reputation was everything. There were no consumer protection laws, no Yelp reviews, no global police to enforce contracts. A dishonest trader could vanish overnight and never be seen again. But a trader with a reputation for fairness and trustworthiness, his name would travel farther than his caravans ever could. That's where Islam's message found its greatest ambassadors, not just in mosques, but in the markets. Joe tilted his head. So you're saying people converted because they saw how Muslims acted? The guest nodded. Exactly. In many cases, it started with simple interactions, a fair deal, a returned item, a word kept. The narrator continued. One of the earliest regions outside Arabia to embrace Islam was East Africa. Along the Swahili coast, Muslim traders from Yemen and Oman crossed the Red Sea not with armies, but with dhows full of goods. They married into local communities, learned local languages, and lived side by side with people of other faiths. Over time, their values, generosity, justice, humility, drew others in. Islam didn't arrive there with banners and war. It arrived with greetings, with shared meals, with trust built over years. The same pattern played out thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia. Take Indonesia, today home to more Muslims than any other country in the world. How did Islam get there? Not a single Muslim army set foot on its shores during its initial spread. Instead, Muslim traders from Gujarat, Yemen and Persia sailed into its harbors. They didn't just sell spices, they built relationships. They were known for never cheating on weights, for keeping their promises, for resolving disputes fairly. Over time, local rulers noticed the harmony within Muslim communities, and some began to adopt the faith themselves. Once leaders converted, many of their people followed, not out of fear, but out of admiration. Joe leaned forward again. That's actually kind of mind-blowing. I mean, in my head, religion spreads through big events, battles, decrees, not small acts like honesty and business. The guest smiled knowingly. That's the thing. People think change has to be loud, but real lasting change is often quiet. A single honest interaction can speak louder than 1,000 speeches. The narrator's voice deepens. In West Africa, Islam's spread followed the gold and salt trade. The great empires of Mali and Songhai became hubs of Islamic learning, not because they were conquered, but because they welcomed Muslim traders and scholars. Timbuktu's libraries and universities flourished, attracting students from across the continent. Here, Islam's appeal wasn't just spiritual, it was intellectual. It brought with it advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. People saw value not just in the faith, but in the civilization it nurtured. Joe raised an eyebrow. So it wasn't just about belief, it was about a whole way of life. Exactly, the guest replied. Islam didn't just offer people a theology, it offered them a framework for justice, for community, for personal conduct, and it backed that up with lived example. The narrator pauses, letting that sink in. Even in regions where Muslim rule did follow military victories, forced conversion was rare. Historical records show that in many newly Muslim-governed lands, Christians, Jews and others were allowed to continue practicing their faith. They paid a tax in exchange for protection, something not unusual for the time, but their beliefs were not stripped from them at sword point.
and that alone set Islam apart from many empires of the era, where religious uniformity was often imposed. Joe looked thoughtful now, his earlier skepticism fading. So if it wasn't about forcing people, what made them choose it? The guest's eyes lit up. It was the consistency. People saw Muslims acting the same way in private as they did in public. They saw fairness in trade, kindness to neighbors, respect for elders, and care for the poor. Over time, they realized these weren't just random good habits, they were rooted in the teachings of Islam. The narrator softens the tone. It's easy to overlook the power of example in an age where ideas spread instantly through screens, but in the centuries before the printing press, before mass media, before social networks, the most powerful form of communication was a human life well lived, and Islam's spread was, in many places, simply the ripple effect of that. The story of a man in Gujarat, treating his customers fairly, could inspire trust in a port city in Sumatra. The generosity of a caravan leader in the Sahara could echo in the marketplaces of Morocco. These moments didn't make headlines, but they made history. Joe sat back in his chair, nodding slowly. Man, that's so different from what you see in movies or read in a lot of history books. It's almost like people don't want to believe something so big could happen through something so small. The guest laughed. Exactly, but sometimes the smallest acts, when multiplied across thousands of lives, can reshape the world. The narrator concludes this part with a gentle pause, and that's the truth about the real engine behind Islam's spread. Not endless battles, not forced conversions, not fear, but trust, example, integrity. These were the quiet forces that carried the faith across oceans and deserts, into hearts and homes, without ever raising a sword. And yet, this still leaves one question unanswered. If Islam really valued freedom of belief, where did that principle come from? The answer to that lies in the heart of the Quran itself, and in the next part, Joe will hear the verse that changes the conversation entirely. Joe's voice softened, almost reverent now, as the conversation took a turn toward the heart of the matter. He pulled out a piece of paper, or maybe it was on the screen in front of him, but you could hear the weight in his tone as he read aloud. There is no compulsion in religion. He paused, then repeated it, slower this time, as if tasting each word for the first time. There is no compulsion in religion. The room grew quiet. You could almost feel the stillness. It was a moment of revelation, a simple phrase, yet one so radical, so centuries ahead of its time, that it challenges many modern assumptions about faith and freedom. The narrator steps in gently. This verse comes from Surah Al-Baqarah chapter 2 verse 2. It's one of the clearest declarations in the Quran, that faith cannot be forced, coerced or bought. Belief is a personal journey, a choice made freely from the heart. Joe sat back, letting the words settle. So that's like a universal human right? Freedom of conscience? The guest nodded. Exactly. And what's remarkable is that this verse was revealed over 1400 years ago, in a time when empires and kings ruled with absolute power, and religious persecution was common. The narrator's voice takes on a historical tone, painting in the 7th century Arabian Peninsula, tribes lived by strict codes of loyalty and survival. Conquest often meant forced conversion, or exile. Yet here, Islam introduced a principle that set it apart, that no one should be pressured in matters of faith. Joe shook his head in amazement. That's huge. I mean, for a religious text that old to say no compulsion, it's almost revolutionary. The guest agreed. It wasn't just revolutionary, it was foundational. This principle influenced how Muslim communities governed themselves and interacted with others. It paved the way for coexistence, for dialogue, for respect of diversity. The narrator expands. This verse isn't an isolated statement, it is woven into the broader ethical fabric of Islam, emphasizing mercy, justice and compassion. It calls believers to invite others to the faith, through wisdom and beautiful preaching, not through force. Joe's voice reflects his awe. So if that's the case, why do so many people still think otherwise? The guest sighed. Because history is complicated. There were moments when Muslims, like any other people, fell short of these ideals. Power can corrupt, and rulers sometimes used religion to justify their own ambitions, but that's a human failing, not a divine mandate. The narrator's tone softened, and here's the crucial part. The Quran's message was clear. Religion isn't a weapon, it's a path chosen willingly, without pressure, and throughout Islamic history, many scholars, rulers and communities upheld this ideal. Joe paused, reflect. That actually makes a lot of sense, especially when you look at the diversity of Muslim societies across history. The guest smiled. Yes, From Muslim Spain to the Ottoman Empire, from the Mughal courts in India, to the trading cities of East Africa, people of many faiths lived together often peacefully, because this principle was respected. The narrator adds, when you understand this verse in context, it changes everything. It redefines Islam, not as a conquering force demanding submission, but as a faith that values freedom, freedom of belief, freedom of conscience. Joe's tone grew quieter, more thoughtful, and that's a message that really needs to be heard today. The guest nodded solemnly, especially now, when religious freedom is a global challenge, when misunderstanding breeds fear. This verse reminds us that faith flourishes when it's freely chosen, and that coercion only breeds resentment. The narrator closes this section with a powerful reflection. The truth in this verse is a beacon of hope, that humanity can choose belief through conviction, not compulsion, that respect for others' choices is a sacred duty, and that the legacy of Islam's spread is not one of force, but of invitation. Joe's voice finally breaks the silence. Man, I had no idea this was such a core part of the Quran. It kind of flips everything on its head. The guest smiled gently, and that's why it's so important to look beyond the headlines, beyond the stereotypes, because the real story of Islam is one of freedom, respect, and profound wisdom. As the camera pulls back, the narrator leaves viewers with a question to ponder. What if more of us embraced this truth, that faith is never forced, only freely given? What kind of world could we build then? Joe's voice was quieter now. There was a softness in his tone, like someone realizing they've just glimpsed something deeply profound. Man, if people actually knew this, if they really understood how Islam spread, they'd see the whole thing completely differently. The guest nodded, a small smile playing on their lips. That's the hope. That truth can break through fear and misunderstanding. The narrator takes a breath and begins. For centuries, the story of Islam's rise has been told through the lens of power struggles, battles, and political ambition. But when you look closer, you find something else. A story of patience, respect, and invitation. Joe's voice cuts in, reflective. It's almost like a lesson for today, you know? That real influence doesn't come from pushing people, but from living your truth so clearly people want to follow. The narrator agrees. Exactly. The history of Islam's spread challenges us to rethink how change happens in the world. It's not about force or fear, it's about authenticity, integrity, consistency. Across continents, from the markets of West Africa to the islands of Indonesia, Islam didn't conquer, it and people responded, not because they were threatened, but because they saw a way of life that spoke to their deepest needs. Joe's voice grows hopeful. When you realize that, it makes you wonder, what else have we misunderstood about each other? The guest adds gently, and that's the key to building bridges today, seeing each other's stories, not just stereotypes, understanding that behind every faith, every culture, there's a human story of longing and search for meaning. The narrator's voice deepens with warmth. This truth invites us all to pause and reflect, to remember that faith is personal, that it thrives in freedom, not force, and that the most powerful way to spread belief is not by raising swords, but by raising heart. Joe's final thought lingers, almost as a call to action. Maybe if more people heard this, there'd be less fear, less division, more curiosity, more respect. The guest nods in agreement, and from that respect comes understanding, and from understanding, peace. The narrator closes gently but firmly. The story of Islam's peaceful spread is not just a historical fact, it's a lesson for our times, a reminder that the greatest movements in history have been propelled, not by violence, but by virtue. So the next time you hear the story of Islam's rise, remember this: it wasn't about forcing belief, but inspiring it, not about domination, but dialogue, and in that truth lies hope for a world where faith connects, rather than divides. The screen fades to black, but the question stays with you. What if we all chose to lead with honesty, kindness, and respect, no matter our beliefs? Because maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest legacy of all.